Hey, today we are going to be talking about goats that are too small to be bred safely. Now, you might be wondering what I am talking about because a lot of people just assume that every goat can be bred as long as it is old enough. So the question I get most often is, how old can my goat be, or how old does my goat have to be before I can breed her? And that is really not quite the right question because size is much more important than her age, although you cannot completely disregard the age. So, one of the most dangerous mistakes I see is people breeding does that are simply too small. And this is why it gets confusing. So, the real rule is that you can breed a goat when it's 2/3 of its adult weight. And people hear that and sometimes think, oh, okay, that's it. So for a Nigerian dwarf that's going to be like around 60, 70 pounds, you want them to be at least 40 pounds before you breed them. However, there is a big difference between a 40-pound goat that is 7 or 8 months old and a 40-pound goat that is 2 or 3 years old. Confused yet? So by the end of this video, you will understand when size is okay, when size is a serious red flag, and why age changes everything. So the big rule is 2/3 of the adult weight. So, if you've got a Nigerian, then that's going to be about 40 pounds. If you've got a standard breed where most of your females are like 150 pounds, then you want your doelings to be 100 pounds before they are bred. And this actually works extremely well. However, when they get older, things get tricky because when you say that a goat needs to be 2/3 of its adult weight, you are assuming that it is going to continue growing. And so if it is 40 pounds by 7 or 8 months of age, by the time it kids, it's actually going to be over 50 pounds, maybe 55 pounds. So it will be quite a bit bigger. Whereas when a goat that is that size and it's 2 or 3 years old, it may not grow anymore. Actually, a 3-year-old is completely done growing, but a 2-year-old that's 40, 45 pounds is worrisome because it may not be big enough to give birth to a kid that is beyond a certain size. And I mean, if you just think about it for a second, a 60 or 70 pound doe is going to have a bigger pelvis, is going to be able to give birth to kids that are much bigger than one that is only 40 pounds. So it is, let's go with a concrete example here. Because the kid is still growing at 7 months to a year or whatever, it's okay to breed them. However, we're assuming that you've got excellent nutrition. So that means if you breed a 7 or 8 month old kid, even if it's 40 pounds, you still need to be feeding it alfalfa hay throughout its whole pregnancy because it's going to be growing fast. You need to be doing 5-point checks routinely to make sure that you're not going to have any parasite problems, because parasites can severely stunt the growth of a goat, and that they are generally just really healthy. So that's not going to be the case. Like if you've got a 2-year-old or 3-year-old that's only 40 pounds, their growth is done. The pelvic size is what it is going to be. And so, although she might be able to give birth to small twins or small triplets, a great big single kid could be catastrophic. You could wind up needing a C-section for a big single. So I want to tell you a little bit about my doe, Giselle, because this happened 20 years ago, actually. It happened in 2005 when I was very new to goats. And actually at that time, all I had ever heard the first 3 years I raised goats was that you can breed your goat when you can breed goats to kid as yearlings. I mean, it seemed everybody I knew those first 3 years was breeding their doe to kid as a yearling. And so we were always breeding our goats around 7 or 8 months of age. And luckily, I realized when Giselle was 7 or 8 months old that she was a lot smaller than any of the other goats in my herd. And so I realized it would not be a good idea to breed her because she just seemed way too small. However, by the time she was a year old, I felt like, well, she's already 5 months behind everybody else. She's a year old now. I know she still kind of looks small, but surely she's, I should breed her now because she's already a year. So I bred her to kid when she was going to be about 18 months old. And she went into labor on Christmas Eve. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, Christmas Day, she starts trying to push out a huge kid. And it was just a nose and a hoof for a long time. It didn't move. And my daughters pulled and I pulled, and we could not make any progress at all. And so at that time, we had a vet who was about an hour away, who I knew actually used to raise pygmies, who are notorious for having birthing problems. So I contacted him, and we met him at the office in the middle of the night on Christmas morning. And I really thought we were going to have a C-section. However, he pulled way harder than I thought would have even been possible. And in fact, my daughter and I were both holding the goat as he was pulling on the legs to get that kid out. And by the time he got the kid out, the poor doe was so traumatized. She looked at the kid like it was an alien, and she wanted to get as far away from it as possible. So she completely rejected the kid. And I happened to notice, because the vet had us put her on an exam table that had a scale on it. And I happened to glance down and see that she weighed, after the kid was out, she weighed 35 pounds. And so when I got home later, I called someone I knew who'd been raising goats for longer than me. And I told her about this, and she said, oh my goodness, I would not have even bred a goat that was 35 pounds. That's much too small. And that was the first time I ever heard somebody say that. And so I thought, okay, well, that was totally my fault. I bred her way too small. So, I'm sure it'll be okay to breed her next year. And what happened the next year was she had triplets, and the first one was presenting shoulder first. So its head was back, its shoulder was there. And the kid had actually been dead for so long that when I started trying to pull it, the skin was tearing on the legs. And so I didn't count that one against her. Even from the very beginning, my goal was to have goats that were very good at kidding on their own. If you go into some Facebook groups, people think they need to be intervening in every birth. And my attitude has always been, I want goats who can give birth on their own. And I was like, well, I can't hold that one against her because that kid had been dead for days before she even went into labor, which is why I wound up in this weird position. When the skin is tearing like that at birth, it means that, the kid's been dead for days. And so did not count that against her. Her third birth, she actually had triplets and did okay. And then the fourth time she kidded, it was such an incredibly hard pull. It reminded me of the vet again. I was pulling on the kid's legs so hard to try and get it out that I fell backwards onto the straw when the kid finally came out. And I was laying there and I screamed at the ceiling of the roof of the barn. I screamed, "You are retired." I thought, oh my gosh, I am never going to breed this goat again, because clearly she is growing kids that are way too big for her pelvis. And I don't know what happened over the course of the next few months, but by the time fall came along, actually, I do know what happened. Giselle had the longest, biggest teats I have ever seen on a Nigerian. And I really, really wanted more does in my herd with those teats. And so, a few months later, I had decided I was going to breed her again. And the next spring, I paid for my ignorance with a C-section. Because once again, she grew a kid that was much too big for her pelvis. And the hooves were there. I mean, when I saw the hooves, I knew. It's like after you've seen enough hooves, when they're huge. And so I knew that those hooves were really big. And this was a really big kid. But I pulled and could not make any progress. So I took her 2 hours to the University Vet Hospital for a C-section, and that kid was over 5 pounds, and he was dead, unfortunately, but Giselle made it. She was fine, and he had a little sister who, unfortunately, if she would have been first in line, she probably would have been fine. Because she was only 3.5 pounds, but unfortunately she was not first, and so he had blocked the exit for her. But I also want to add at this point that I have taken 6 goats in out of, we're getting close to 800 kids now. I've taken 6 goats in. I've always had to drive 1 to 2 hours to get to a vet. And almost all the kids have been born alive after driving that long. And the does have all survived the trip and managed to either have the kids born by C-section or give birth successfully. So even if you have a vet that's an hour or 2 away, that is not too far to drive with a goat in labor. In fact, once you put them into the car, their body gets so whacked out that their labor just stops. So they actually are seem to be quite comfortable for the drive. They've always been very quiet for the drive because they just completely stop having contractions at the point that you move them. They're that far into labor and you move them that they just stop. So looking back on it, I realized that the problem was, this was all the way back in 2005. If you've seen many of my videos, you know that we had 20 years ago, a lot of really severe parasite problems. And Giselle had a really bad case of parasites as a kid, and that stunted her growth. So she had the genetics of a much bigger goat, and a goat's genetic code does not change if their growth gets stunted by parasites. So that's why she was so small and why she kept growing kids that were too big for her pelvis. So after that was like, okay, 2 strikes, you're out. And I have only ever had 2 goats that where I have instituted the 2 strikes rule, and it was a mother and her daughter. So I bought the mother. She had 2 strikes. I had to intervene in 2 births. That's it. She was retired. And then one of her daughters had problems. And after the second time, that's it. You're retired. So this is like really important, that people pay attention and do not believe anybody who tells you that you need to be intervening in all the births. If you do, you're either, not letting her do what she's capable of doing. So then you don't know if she can do it. And you could be unknowingly perpetuating poor genetics, or, you are intervening in a goat that needs help and you are just perpetuating poor genetics. Because they should be able to give birth without intervention. So in hindsight, it was quite obvious. But I also want to point out that this is not just a Nigerian dwarf thing. It applies to any breed. So it's really important, if you've got an Alpine that's like 70 pounds at a year, or whatever. Like I wouldn't breed an Alpine that is a lot smaller. It is all about what you can expect. Now, unfortunately, if you have a mixed breed, you may not know, like if you have a goat, sometimes people breed, like a boar doe to a dairy buck, in which case you might not be too sure about the size. But in that case, I would just wait I would assume the larger size and pay attention to, has this goat had any serious parasite challenges? How is this goat's growth compared to its siblings, which when it's a cross, it could still be very different. You could have one that's a lot bigger than the other one. But it needs to be gaining weight pretty regularly. So if you have a cross, it is a little bit trickier to know what size the animal should be when it's fully grown. But certainly if it has had some serious parasite challenges when it was a kid, that could definitely affect its growth. So it does get a little bit trickier though with that. The other thing is that if you have a goat that is really small, you could be dealing with a disease like Johne's, but also a chronic infection like Staph aureus or something, so that this goat's immune system has been struggling forever and not able to put more energy into growing because it's struggling so hard just to keep the goat alive. So that's really important to think about that. And so you definitely, let me check on the questions here. I see that we've got a few questions. Somebody said it's not live. No, too bad, it was live. But I don't look at questions because it distracts me. So I tend to look at questions to take a break. And this is why I don't look at questions, because there's a lot of spam in the questions that are basically, I need to ban some people. So, all right, there's a lot of spam coming from YouTube. So anyway, that is basically the information that I wanted to share with you today. And please note that just because a goat can get pregnant does not mean that she should get pregnant. And that if a doe has problems, it's better to retire her sooner rather than later, so that you don't wind up with problems just getting worse with each kidding, like my situation with Giselle. Because the goal really is to have safe births, not just trying to get more kids on the ground. So it's been fun chatting with you today. If you're ever wondering if your doe is big enough, then feel free to ask in the comment section, and we will be happy to chat about that with you.